Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry, where today we are having a new American premium Tier 10 battleship. This is the non-existent USS Rhode Island. However, the Rhode Island isn't as far from existing as the first impression might get you to believe. So the Americans had a bit of a problem, just like everybody else. After the Washington and London naval treaties, they were not building battleships, which means by the time they got back into building battleships, designs had been evolving and the world had been evolving around them as well. So going along with the 21 knots is good enough for anybody, that didn't quite fly anymore. The other problem was that now carriers existed, and to the annoyance of the US Navy, carriers were relatively fast, at least to the annoyance of the parts that actually had to keep up with them to escort them. Carriers routinely did about 30 knots and above, which means that even some destroyers were occasionally struggling to keep up with their escorting duties, which means having a battleship or battlecruiser that did 21 knots or 23 knots if somebody got out and pushed and it went downhill didn't quite work out that well. So in that regard, something faster was needed, and designs had evolved since the end of the First World War. Even though people were not actually building any battleships, that didn't stop anybody from designing them. There were a couple of them around for a new type of battleship. Now, we weren't going to call that a battlecruiser. No, this was a fast battleship. This was meant to be relatively well armored, even though not as well armored as everybody thought it should have been due to treaty limitations. But it was definitely a battleship, not a battlecruiser, and it should have been fast enough to escort a fleet carrier. That would eventually become the USS North Carolina and her respective class, but there were a fair amount of designs leading up to that. And one of the designs, which was the Design Draft 16, may have been the basis for this particular ship here. USS Rhode Island, by the way, existed, but that was a turn-of-the-century pre-dreadnought, so the name hasn't actually been in use in that regard, but this was, if this is the underlying design, one that was still based on the 14-inch gun limitation that was part of the London Naval Treaty, and that would eventually be turning into the escalator-clause because Italy and eventually Japan as well refused to sign the second treaty, and then they never got around to using the 14-inch guns because by the time escalator-clause meant that the ships weren't quite far ahead yet, they could still change it around and use 16 inches instead, which is what we've seen on the North Carolinas, on the Iowas, on everything else. But this would have been one of the 14-inch armed designs, and with a positively French mounting of main guns, because this ship would have had 3 quadruple turrets of 14-inch guns. Now, what do we have here in-game, and what in the world is that doing at Tier 10? Well then, the North Carolina is a Tier 8, but we do have, and I have intentionally put the Florida in here, we do have another ship with these kind of guns at Tier 7. So let's do a quick comparison between the Rhode Island and the Montana, which is the Tech Tree Tier 10 battleship, just so we're sort of getting at level of what things are looking like at Tier 10 here. The first two things that stand out is that the Rhode Island is somewhat deficient in hit points for Tier 10, and the armor plating is also relatively weak, at least what we can glean from the general damage reduction. This is more of what we would generally see on battle cruisers. That said, the Rhode Island is proper quick, and for an American battleship actually surprisingly maneuverable. But yes, 356mm or 14-inch guns. However, she gets the same amount as the Montana and makes up for the lack of, well, somewhat for the lack of shell caliber with a significantly faster reload. The secondaries also have a surprisingly long range on this ship, and the AA is not quite as good as on the Monty, but she does get the defensive AA to work with that. And she has a relatively good concealment. Oh yeah, and because we skipped over it, obviously this ship does not get the rapid reload. So we are dealing with an engine boost Def AA radar battleship. So let's compare her to the Tier 7 and see what the difference is, shall we? Well, obviously she does have more hit points than the Florida at Tier 7, but the armor is not that much better. In fact, the damage reduction looks actually worse. So this is very much a compromise ship of, okay, we're going to put 12 guns on it, but we just don't have the displacement to put significant amount of armor onto it, which is a bit of an issue. Now she is, like I said, proper quick, and the maneuverability is pretty good as well, but we are now at Tier 10. And yes, the guns are obviously better. We have a much better base range, and they do a reasonable amount more damage, but they're still effectively the Florida's Mark 11 14-inch guns that we're now seeing at Tier 10, just with a 5.5 second faster base reload. So what do we do with something that is effectively a battle cruiser, at least by, I mean, the Americans don't want to hear that, but at least by in-game mechanics standards, it's probably better to classify this as a battle cruiser, because the armor is dreadful, and you definitely don't want to get shot at by this in this thing. Well, you get the traditional American choice between better fire and flooding resistance, given that you have a 30% base. That is actually not a completely terrible value. Still, it's usually accepted that you want range, and more range on these ships. So 4% extra range is what we're going with here. You get the historical camouflage, which is not a traditional battleship camo. So it gives hit points, range, dispersion, and max traverse speed, rather than the generally not very useful torpedo damage reduction. Alternatively, you can, if you really wanted the torpedo damage reduction, turn it into a hot rod. Complete with the America Eagle in front. And that would be the Rhode Island if you insist of not getting traverse speed, but rather have improved torpedo damage reduction on this thing. You have access, as is traditional for American battleships, to the artillery plotting room module, which gives you range on the secondaries and on the main guns, and is normally considered to be a useful addition. And I would argue that that's probably the case here as well. Mostly because this is a very squishy ship. American battleships are not known to be particularly well armored. They're pretty well on the average, but this makes it... it feels a lot like a British battlecruiser in terms of armor, without the superheal and the HP tank capabilities. So having extended range is a good thing. The not so good thing is that, unlike British battlecruisers, these are the American shotgun dispersion. So even though you have 12 guns at 15 kilometers, getting 2 or 3 shells on target is more the norm than the exception. So another possible option would be to use the main battery mod 3 for improved precision. I've tried both, and I think both are valid choices here. The artillery plotting room is also a good one. And yes, because it is a battle cruiser and it is very squishy, I am actually sailing it with the concealment module. I am more and more getting into favor of that, especially on large ships. But in this case, it really is a necessity, because if you get spotted early by Vermonts or Yamatos or Slavas, which is, I think, in a crate right now, yeah. You don't have an awful lot of hit points to begin with, and you don't have the armor to sustain incoming fire very well. This ship also, you might think, because you have the defensive AA, that you can, sail out there and defend yourself against incoming airstrikes. That is very much not the case in Tier 10 anymore. You can make good use of it, fighting with your team, but I wouldn't try to take on an enemy carrier alone with a Def AA1 and a 2/3 of a Montana AA. So with the defensive AA app, you sort of have the same AA as a Monty, which means you can punish the carrier somewhat for the incoming strike, but you are going to take the incoming strike, and you don't have the hit point pool to survive that very long. Now, when it comes to commander skills, obviously we don't need the fire supremacy or the marksman skill or the master reloader skill. which means that commanders that you have either on the Vermont line of battlecruisers, well, or alternate battleships, they're really not battlecruisers, or on the Montana line of rapid reload battleships, none of them is going to be a particularly good fit, because what you really need here is the survivalist and the fully prepared skill to make the best out of the limited amount of health that you have. And that's why I'm actually using Chandler here, which is not a commander I'm using very frequently. In fact, this is, I think, the first time I'm using it, but he's a relatively good fit in my opinion. He does get the Artillery Maintenance Expert Plus, gives you an additional 4% of dispersion while you have more than 75% of your HP, and if you're staying in the back at the beginning of the battle, biding your time, then that is not a bad skill to have. He also gives us an additional radar and an additional def AA, so this gives us 3 radars, which against enemy destroyers can be a nasty surprise, especially if you're in the rear guard and a destroyer is sneaking around the flank and thinking, haha, I am just going to smoke up and torpedo the battle line just to be radared by a battleship. Certainly not something a destroyer will necessarily come to expect. So some quite hilarious moments can ensue from that. Unfortunately, he's giving the IFHE Plus skill, but APCS is what you do want to be firing on this ship, because the, I think, 10% fire chance is not particularly great, and the HE shells on these ships are really just there to fire at enemy destroyers. We are going to be playing, as usual, 2 rounds, and we'll see how well a tier 10 Florida with worse armor than in tier 7 is holding up, and what we can do with this thing. The first game will be played in Epicenter mode on the Cage map against an Essex, Yamato, Colombo, a Prinz Ruprecht, a Buffalo, and a Jutland. The Jutland is probably, given that there are 2 Essexes in the game, not going to be too keen to actually rush out, especially that we do have a Dalian here and a Des Moines, although the Des Moines is a bot, so that's probably not going to be a huge difference. Now, in a traditional battleship, you probably want to be part of the battle line. You just camp the outer ring and unload, and you can do this in the ship as well, although not for long, because it really feels like you have more of a supercruiser armor here in this thing. So I play this a lot more like you would, say, a Puerto Rico or an Alaska, and the gun caliber isn't that far off from these ships either. So that is a more apt sort of play style for these ships, and that means not actually rushing into the main line and tanking, but I am going to head over towards the Delny on our team and try to lend some AA support, because it is only an Essex, it is only a bottom tier carrier, and I've got the def AA up, and we'll see what we can do about these planes here. At least we can take a couple of them down. There's also a bot Des Moines out here, so that's a good thing. That's the enemy Donskoy, that's a bot. They'll get some shots out here. The dispersion, like I mentioned, is not great, and as you just noticed. And there is firing coming from the Yamato, so I'm definitely going to scoot behind the island here, just to make sure that I am not I'm not taking fire on early from the enemy battle line, while the team is duking it out in the middle. But we only have a bot Des Moines on the flank here, and there is a Christopher Colombo coming down the road. Now, you don't want to get into a brawl with the Colombo, because the Colombo is an actual battleship. This thing, not so much. So a manual aim for the deck, although the dispersion is usually not that great, but this was a good one. We got 8 out of 12 on target, and that wasn't terrible. Now Colombo is smoking up. It is just a fuel smoke, but I'm just going to negate it here, so I can get shots out at the Colombo. And I think there is a Yamato back there shooting at me. So we are technically kiting away from a Christopher Colombo while he is busy dealing with the Des Moines, and the Des Moines has been killed by the enemy Buffalo. We're going to have to turn around here because I'm getting a little far away from everything, but that's a Colombo. He's got a 30-second or so reload, if I remember correctly. So we don't necessarily need to be giving broadside to that thing until it shoots, because we do want to preserve our hit points here. There comes the fire, and unfortunately for me it was semi-armor piercing, So in that, he's now on the reload, and I think I should be having him probably, if I can get the forward turret around, and be able to complete the turn here by the time that he's got his guns reloaded, because he's going to be so low on hit points that, yep, he's turning away. So he has to turn away, he has to disengage, and that means there's also friendly Minnesota over here. That means I can now turn around in relative safety. There comes the incoming fire. He has switched to the armor piercing, but I've mostly ducked under it because he's now far away enough that he's not a massive threat anymore. And we can rain some more death and destruction onto him if we can actually hit anything at this range. That was not the case, as usual. Dispersion said no. Now we are relatively far away from the battle, which is not a massive problem in this ship, unlike other American battleships, because she has a 33 knot base speed. That thing does destroyer speeds if you switch the engine boost on. Let's see if we can reacquire the Colombo and finish him off. The team is holding the center cap, so there's really no urgency to get in there. And we have successfully distracted the enemy Colombo for long enough that he wasn't any threat to our destroyers. And there's still the Yamato out there and the Buffalo. But let's see if we can finish off the Colombo just on the quick. Yep, there's incoming fire, but they have missed. And the carrier's on the ball there. I think the Colombo is going to go down to the carrier's flooding. So, yep, Essex has killed the Colombo. So we can, again, sail at range here, because there's still a Yamato out there, and give some fire support against the enemy Buffalo. Now, this is usually how you kind of want to play the ship. And I can do a little bit of air support here still, although the fighters are on the return leg, and just drawing fire from the Buffalo, giving some cover to the Dalian. This is usually how you want to play the ship, carefully, at range, until you have a fight that you can clearly win, because you have a triple insta-fire from the Buffalo, thank you, until you have a fight that you can win. Because if you are getting shot at by the big guns out in the game, things usually don't end very well for you. On the flip side, that unfortunately means that your damage output generally suffers, because while these guns are reloading relatively quickly, the penetration is not the greatest in tier 10. They are 14 inches only, and the precision is not also the greatest either. So even though you have 12 guns, getting more than 4 or 5 on target against a ship that is actually actively evading you can be a little tricky. The forward gun placement lends itself quite nicely to bow-in action, and if RNG says yes, then you get your shells on target very nicely. If RNG says no, then rather not so much. So. The dispersion can be a little funky from time to time, and I think that should be a dead Essex from those torpedoes from the Somers. Yep, well done Somers. That just leaves the Yamato, but unfortunately the enemy team ran out of time, and we couldn't get any more points in. But generally, somewhere between a 60 to, let's say, 80,000 points of damage is what you can kind of expect, and I find that a bit on the low end for a tier 10 battleship. You should be on a good tier 10 battleship. You should be able to sort of breach the 100,000 without too much trouble. So let's try that again with the APCS skill. So let's bring out our second round. Base capture and Hourglass. I like Hourglass. I keep saying that. It's one of my favorite maps actually. We are once again up against an Essex, accompanied by a Vermont, Minnesota, Ibuki, a Kleber, and a Shimakaze. Off we go. And the reason I like Hourglass, especially in something that has a very good range, is because of the island positions. So I am spawning on the flank, which is good, and that means I can park myself behind the little island over there. I've got a Tromp with me, and I have completely forgotten what the Tromp was capable of. But it's Dutch, so it's probably got the relatively good AA. So we should be set in terms of AA on this flank here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to park behind the island, and I'm going to see if I can compensate for my lack of armor with some positioning here, while the Tromp is going over into the center area to scout. The friendly carrier is not particularly busy just yet in that regard. So we will see. We will see. But this island position here is where I want to be, especially that this is a relatively fast ship. So with the engine boost up, I can run this flank if I need to relatively quickly. But for now, I'm just going to position myself here. And there is the enemy Ibuki. Now, where are you going, Ibuki? Ibuki is going slowly this way. So shots out at the Ibuki at close to 15 kilometers. And I think I could have led that a little bit more. And that was good. That was good. And we now also have the Minnesota. Now, do note that I am unspotted. I am not unspotted because of the concealment module. I'm unspotted because there is nobody on the right flank that does the spotting. So I have the island between myself and the enemy ships, which means they cannot see me. And that means shooting back at me is going to be relatively unpleasant for them because they can't see me. Now I'm spotted. So somebody is either spotting me from the center or somebody is coming down the right flank. So let's ask the carrier if maybe he can air spot a little bit. While, yeah, there comes the incoming fire while slowly backing off. But now I'm no longer spotted, so I'm going a little bit more behind the island. A couple more shots out at the Minnesota. Nobody can spot me from the center area, but I can't back off too much further here. That's sort of how you want to play the beginning of the battle, because you really need to preserve your hit points. Getting shot at in this ship is not something you very much relish. Now, no one seems to be coming down the flank, so I am going to put the engine into forward again, because now I'm getting a little far away from everything. And get the engine boost up, see if I can land some shots on that, supporting shots on that Minnesota over there. And there is the enemy Shimakaze in the central area, while the Somers is trying to torpedo, I think, the Minnesota, but the Ibuki has just taken down the Somers because, and by the looks of it, the Somers has not achieved, no, he went for the Vermont. Okay, so he got a couple torpedo hits in, but was it worth that to suicide into it? Maybe, maybe not. I'd rather say not. So we're ship down at this point, and I have got a Shimakaze to shoot at. Now, with destroyers, it's interesting. This is with APCS, and I'm at just about 7 kilometers. So I'm over-penetrating. So I want to give it one more shot and see if I can maybe get a full penetration, because I am sailing away. But I've got a lot of secondaries. Give it one more salvo and then I'll switch to the high explosive. So shots out, high explosive. And yeah, mostly over penetration. Shimakaze smokes up. That's not going to help you. Now the Shimakaze couldn't know that. Carrier comes in to help out. I'm keeping the island between myself and Shima, so he doesn't have a torpedo angle at me. And I've now got the HE loaded. Shima is on almost no hit points, back to the armor piercing, and then two things happen. Dispersion says nope, and the Vermont starts shooting at me. So I'm immediately losing half of my hit points. And Shimakaze is unfortunately still alive. So let's see if I can get another shot out at the Shima while also dodging the incoming airstrikes here. Unfortunately, at this point, Shima went undetected. Vermont has taken the lock on, so these shots are probably missing. And Shima gets away with it, and I have to dodge the incoming torpedoes, which means that once again I am giving an uncomfortable amount of broadside to that Vermont over there. Fortunately, he doesn't land the shots very well. So in these kind of scenarios, in this ship, you want to play as a cruiser. Play this like a heavy cruiser. Go bow in. You've got 8 guns forward. You're basically a Jean Bart pointing forward with slightly reduced firepower, but fast reload. So just time the reload, and I want to time the next shot from the Vermont. Let's see. There it comes. Okay. That has hurt, but not as bad as it could have if I had given broadside. So now we're going forward. Vermont is running low on hit points, which means his guns are out of alignment. I've got a heel coming off, and I think we have won this flank. Now, see if we can actually finish off the Vermont with the rear turret. Probably not, because again, dispersion is more than questionable at times. Yep, straddled it. The carrier is coming in to help out as well, so together, nope, still wasn't enough, and the Essex finishes off the Vermont. Well done. We're a kill ahead at this point, and that means we can start pushing. We're out of engine boosts, but there's an Ibuki back there, and now we can make the run towards the enemy capture circle. We've got about half our hit points left, and that should be enough. We've lost the ship, but that should be enough to finish that off and complete the game. Let's see if we can spot the carrier. Blind shot out. You can be a little bit more aggressive with using your salvos because you've got a 16-second reload. So they come back pretty quickly. But we'll just look at the planes and see where they're landing, and then see if we can... There's the Essex. Okay, shots out. There's still Ibuki, and there's still one destroyer out there somewhere. I have no idea where it went, but shots out at the Essex, and see if we can farm a little bit of damage. But even with the APCS Plus, it's not the APCS Plus, the regular APCS, it's not a massive amount that you're making there. And again, the Ibuki actually gets in the way. I would prefer to hit the Essex, but I'm going to hit something. Yep, and finally we landed the Citadel. And see, the Essex might be able to get away. I've got a good shot at the Ibuki, but I have to slow down because of potentially Ibuki torpedoes coming in. Can we blap the Ibuki out of his existence? And the answer is no, we cannot. We're gonna wait for the Yamato to take the shot because the Essex has gone undetected. So Yama's get the shots out at the Ibuki. If he can't finish him off, I'm gonna have another go. And it looks like I might actually get the Ibuki in the end, which we need to because we're actually behind on points at this stage. Because it looks like we've lost our carrier somewhere in the process, and the enemy destroyer has managed to get into a capture circle. But Yama has avoided Ibuki torpedoes. We've killed the Ibuki in the last second, and the game is won. But still, like about 70,000 points of 75,000 points of damage, even with the APCS, is not a great amount. So all in all, I would say it's not a very powerful ship. It's distinctly average, I would say, or even below average in terms of damage output. The 14 inches just don't cut it, and she doesn't have the precision of, say, a Puerto Rico or an Alaska to consistently target things like deck armor. You really don't want to get into a brawl with it if you can avoid it. That said, she is reasonably maneuverable, she's reasonably stealthy, and she's very quick. So I would argue that if you enjoy Battlecruiser playstyle and you're more of a cautious player, and you don't, or if you enjoy super cruisers, if you're happy with the sort of 12, 13, 14 inch caliber 300 to 350 millimeter, then this might be a ship for you. If you're a traditional American battleship player, you might be somewhat disappointed just by the damage output that comes from this ship. And because at tier 10, it really doesn't cut it anymore. I think she would have been better positioned as a tier 9 premium. And there she probably would have been an actual good ship. I think for tier 10, she's just a bit underpowered. But that's it for me today. Now you know, and knowing's half the battle. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.